So this day is dedicated to Mori Rabbi Ezra Labaton. I have to say that I am recalling that Rabbi Labaton was really the first to have this idea of classes on Tish'a. I'm going back 30 years ago, and I remember working for Ricky Cohen at the time and working with Rabbi Labaton, and we put together classes in his shul, and it's amazing to see how this has grown over the decades. Any shul bursting with classes, the day here, it's just beautiful. Rabbi Labaton was so unique, influenced me so tremendously, and I miss him greatly. So this day is dedicated to him. Should be an aliyah after his neshama. I think that Tish'a BeAb is a hard day for some of us to relate to, as opposed to the other holidays. You know, Pesach is kind of clear, the theme of freedom. Shavuot is also clear in terms of our accepting the concept of Torah and mitzvot. But I feel that when it comes to Tish'a BeAb, we find a little bit difficult, at least I can speak for myself, to mourn a loss that we never experienced, something that was never part of our lives to begin with. And here we're supposed to be feeling this great sense of missing. And the question is, well, what exactly are we missing? There's a number of different ways that this class that I wanted to do today could go. I thought we would talk a little bit about what was, in order really though to look at what we could do going forward. Meaning, we're going to try to fill in a little bit of the gaps that we have in terms of what are we missing, and to look back in order to look forward. And we have a lot of sources to do, and I think I bit off more than I could chew, but we'll see how much we get to. Everybody has a source sheet. If you want one, they're over here, and we're gonna get started, and we'll see how much we can accomplish. The first thing I thought we should do in order to almost like get ourselves into the mood, so to speak, is to look at when this destruction actually took place. I don't know how many of you are students of Jewish history. There's a lot there, but we're going to just look at a glimpse of it. We're not looking at the whole story, obviously, but we're looking at the first source, which is coming from Melachim Bet, which talks about, and we're kind of jumping into the middle of the story, where we talk about the Galut of Yehoiachin. I think it is a very telling passage, which is why I brought this out, so that it could give us a sense of what happened and what are we missing. So I'll read some of it in Hebrew, and you can feel free to follow on the English side if that's more comfortable. Ben 18 shana Yehoiachin b'malcho u'shloshah chodeshim malach b'Yerushalayim. So this is Yehoiachin, who was the king at the time in Judea. Vayaz hara b'nei Hashem chol asher asa aviv. He was an evil king. Ba'et hahi alu avdei Nebuchadnezzar melech Babel Yerushalayim atavo ha'ir b'matzor. So we all know that the enemy of the Jews at the time in the first temple is Melech Babel Nebuchadnezzar. He comes to Jerusalem and he lays it siege. Vayavo Nebuchadnezzar Melech Babel al ha'ir v'avadat tzarim aleh. So in a terrible situation here, where the enemy has come, surrounded the city. Vayitzei Yehoiachin melech Yehuda melech Babel hu v'imo v'avadat v'sarav v'sarisav vayikach oto melech Babel b'shnat shmona lemachot. So in the 8th year of Yehoiachin's rule, he's taken by the king of Babel, of Babylonia. And this is a very telling pasuk for those of you who've been to Italy. I'll refer to it in a minute. Vayotzeh misham et kol otzrot beit Hashem ve'otzrot beit HaMelech. Took out all of the treasures that were in the Beit HaMikdash, the vessels, ve'katzet et kol klei zahav, all the gold vessels asher asa Shlomo HaMelech Melech Yisrael. The original vessels that King Solomon brought into the temple were taken by Melech Babel Beit Hashem, kasher di Beit Hashem, ve'higla et kol Yerushalayim, ve'et kol Esrim, ve'et kol Giburei HaChayil. Took into exile all of the officers and the important people, 10,000 of them. Who did Melech Babel leave? Only the weak. All the strong people, all the people of stature, were taken. Okay. So this is, by the way, called the Galut of the Charash and Masger. That's the Hebrew term that's used, meaning all the knowledgeable people in terms of how to build things and do things. They were all taken, and only the weak were left in Jerusalem. Any of you have ever been to Italy and you've seen the Arch of Titus? So this is a graphic description, like an actual description of of the exile of the Jews. Granted, it's the second temple, and I'm talking here about the first temple, but the concept is the same. The idea of taking the Jews out and the amount of destruction, the total destruction, is I think encapsulated in that very sad relief that's there in Italy. So this idea of having here a total destruction. By the way, the Navi Exile is also going out in this galut, right? Navi Exile, and as we said, Babel ends up taking over and just leaving behind the weakest, and he elects Tzidkiyahu, who is the next king, who will bear the brunt of the final destruction. This is in the middle of the destruction. And we have, this you don't have on your source sheet, U'b'chodesh ha'chamishi b'shiva l'chodesh yishna shana l'melech Nebuchadnezzar. Melech Babel comes, Nebuzaradan Rav Tabachim, Eved Melech Babel Yishayim, Vayisrof et Beit Hashem. The final destruction takes place with the next king, Tzidkiyahu, and Jerusalem and the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, stops being the spiritual center of the Jewish people until the Bayit Sheni, until the second temple, with the rise of Ezra and Nehemiah, and once the second temple is destroyed, till today, we are in Galut. So this is a description when we go back to the sources to try to see, and I try to ask myself, like, how could we fathom this? Like, how does this affect us? If we had to give it some sort of a comparison for today, I can only imagine if God forbid, every single shul that we ever knew of is just gone, and everybody's uprooted from their homes and taken far away to Asia, who knows where, and we're left without all the things that we know about what it means to be a Jewish people and to be a Jewish nation. That's what I imagine. And then when you read Echa, as we all did last night, you see the tremendous scenes of total destruction. It's heart-wrenching, the description of what goes on in Echa, the starvation, the streams of blood that are described there. It's just horrific. We don't realize that 1 million people died in this destruction, and 100,000, I'm talking now about Bayit Sheni, 100,000 were taken captive, and as we mentioned, taken to Rome, and were slaves there. The more we think about it, the more we could start to get into this idea of understanding how miserable this time was for the Jewish people. Miserable is like an understatement. And then we have the famous line, if you look at your next source, if you switch to the next page, I have a different source sheet. Here you go, Jen. Where Yeshayahu says, Echa hayta lezona, kirya ne'emana, le'ati mishpat tzedek, yalim ba, ve'ata leratzchim. Sorry, I didn't know you didn't have. So this idea that, in the next page, Yeshayahu, he says, how could it be that the city that she was once a faithful city filled with justice, and now she's become like a harlot, murderers are within her, meaning it's a total upheaval of what Jerusalem was meant to be, and now it's its exact opposite. And as we read again last night, and we see from our discussion today, the idea that Jerusalem became something completely different than what it was meant to be. It was meant to be the light unto the nations, and yet now it became completely destroyed. So this idea that Yerushalayim declined and this total destruction, it's something that it's hard for us, even though we read it and we try to get into this head, it's kind of hard for us to relate, but we try. And the rabbis actually help us. They help us in terms of the whole concept of these 3 weeks and the way that we mourn, and we come to this day of Tish'a, which we'll look at in a second. But before we do that, let's look at the next source from the Mishnah in Ta'anit, because unfortunately, the destruction of the first temple and the second temple were not the only tragedies that took place on this day. As we read yesterday in Shul in Sefer Devarim, Chamisha Devarim ir'u et avotenu b'shiv'asar b'tamuz v'chamisha b'Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av nigzar al avotenu shelo yikansu la'aretz. On Tisha B'Av, we were told that we were not going to be going into Eretz Yisrael. That was after the Chet of the Meraglim, the sin of the spies. The Charev Habayit Barishona Bashniya, the 2 Batei HaMikdash were destroyed. By the way, I tell this to my students all the time because our school is really overlooking the Temple Mount. I say that is where the 2 Batei HaMikdash stood. Ben el-Kedah B'Tav, Ben el-Chasha'ir. All these difficult events took place on Tish'a B'Av, and we have the statement in the Mishnah, Mishenechnas Av Mema'atin Besimcha. We have this concept of when we come into, it's actually on your next source, Mishenechnas Av Mema'atin Besimcha, as opposed to Adar, which is the holiday, the month where we start to become much more happy. When it comes time for the holiday, for the month of Av, now we start to minimize our happiness. What's also interesting, by the way, is I don't know how many of you think we have to walk around like really sad, really depressed, this is a very sad time. We do have to get into that mindset, but notice how the language is mema'atin b'simcha. We're still in a state of happiness, but we're just kind of minimizing that amount of happiness, and that of course comes through in all of the laws of the 3 weeks that take place. If we go, I'm trying to move to, I think, the next source now. Yeah, if you flip to the next page, the Gemara in Yevamot talks about this idea that what are we doing during these 3 weeks? We're going through a certain mourning period, and it's exemplified by the minimization of a lot of the happy things that we do. We don't have weddings, we don't have parties, we don't listen to music. As the 9 days approaches, we become even more strict, not eating meat. And then we have the week of Tish'a and finally Tish'a itself. So the Gemara in Yevamot that you have over there, it describes how the loss of the Beit HaMikdash actually is something that encompasses, when we commemorate it, it encompasses looking back and also looking forward. And that's actually the title of this class. So Amar Rav Asher, Shaneh Avelut Chadasha Me'avelut Yeshana, V'Shaneh Avelut Berabi Me'avelut Yachid. So here the Gemara is describing the difference between what's called Avelut Chadasha, which is considered like a newer type of mourning, as opposed to an older type of mourning, an ancient mourning. And the Gemara also describes the difference between Avelut that has to do with the nation and an Avelut that has to do with the individual. Those are two different things. So what we actually see, if we look carefully at what happens during the 3 weeks, we come, and this is all in an effort to get us to really feel this ancient mourning, which is hard for us to feel. We actually see almost like an inversion of the mourning process that happens for an individual. God forbid nobody should know from it, but if somebody is mourning the loss of the person dear to them, so the most severe form of mourning takes place originally at the day of death and during the first week of Shiv'ah, and then it lessens as we get to the Shloshim, the 30 days after the person passes away, and it lessens even more so toward the year. The opposite is taking place now in the 3 weeks. So in the 3 weeks, we have an inversion of this process whereby the less stringent laws are taking place in the 3 weeks, like we mentioned, not having parties, smachot, not building, not doing a lot of things like that, and then slowly coming into the 9 days and then into the week for the. I always say my friend who's Ashkenaz, she's like 9 days not doing laundry. I don't know how that works, but okay. And then for us, we have the week of Tisha B'Av and then Tisha B'Av itself. So we have this inversion of this mourning process designed to help us kind of like get into the mood, so that when we come to Tisha B'Av, really the statement that's made is like as if a person has to feel as if Hamet Mutal Lefanav, like the idea that it's as if that person is experiencing the death of someone who is beloved near them, so that it's really real for us. Okay, so this is looking back, trying to get to a point where we can feel today what the loss is from the past. But now if we look at Rambam in the next source, what we see is that the actual process of fasting, at least, has its source in the Torah itself. If we look at Rambam's Mishneh Torah Achot Taniyot, he says, "Mitzvah taseh min haTorah lizok u'le'ariv v'chatzatzot al kol tzara shetavo la'tzibur." It's actually a mitzvah from the Torah. Rambam describes for us to cry out and to call to God at the time he was on the chatzatzot, which were the trumpets during the Beit HaMikdash. How do we know this? It says in Bamidbar, when something bad befalls you, the Jewish people, you have an obligation to call out to God. So it's a positive commandment from the Torah. The Rambam is describing to us this idea that we should call out and really seek God when bad things happen to us, right? And this might seem commonsensical, but it's also on a national level that we have this obligation. He continues further. By the way, I'm sorry, I'm following my. He's now in Mishneh Torah Achot Taniyot Bet, so it's on the second page, whatever it is on the bottom here. It says, not only are we calling out, but there's a purpose to this calling out. Davar zeh midarkei hatshuva שבזמן שתבוא צרה ויזעקו עליה וידעו הכל שבגלל מעשיהם הרעים הוא רע להם. ככתוב, So Rambam goes on to say that not only is there an obligation for us to call out during a time of national difficulty and national tragedy. And by the way, we should all keep in mind Israel at this time, what's going on now, and Bezat Hashem, our chayalim should be safe, and it should be a quick operation. So the idea that when bad things happen to us, we call out is part of the process of teshuvah. It's not just that we're calling in and we're saying, like, God, God, you help us. We're sitting here waiting. We're passively waiting for you to make everything better. But we have an active role to play in making things better. When there's a tzara, when there's something wrong going on, and we call out, we have to know, Rambam says, everyone will know that it's because of our evil deeds that this bad was done to them. Rambam is describing the fact that on a national level, we're not getting into the topic now of tzaddik v'ra'ah, which we talked about at other Tish'a B'Av's, the idea when bad things happen to good people. Here we're talking on a national level, the idea that when these things happen to us as a people, we have to look inwards and say, what's going wrong with us? What are we doing that is potentially bringing this on? And when we go through this process of looking inward, introspecting, and trying to figure out what is going wrong, then we'll be able, according to Rambam, to remove the trouble that befell us. So this is one of the things I wanted to sort of bring out here, is that as we're looking back in the past and we're looking at what went wrong, if we look only at Tisha B'Av as a day that happened and it's a historical event and it's not happening to us now, then we've kind of like missed the message. So let's look a little bit further in what Harambam is saying in the next halacha in Hilchot Taniyot. It says, "Yesham yamim shekol Yisrael nitanim b'hem mipnei atzeret she'u b'hem." There are days when all of the Bnei Israel, whoever needs a source sheet, there are days when all of Israel is fasting because of the tzarot, because of the bad things that befell them. Why do we fast? And what's the purpose of every fast that we have? It's not just to commemorate what went on, but it's also to open us up, to get us to be motivated, to change, to be different, to not just say what was will be. And this is, I'm alluding to what we're going to do at the end. Zikaron למעשינו הרעים ומעשי אבותינו שהיה כמעשינו עתה עד שגרם להם ולנו אותן הצרות. Very interestingly, Rambam sees the Jewish people as this organic whole, meaning what happened in generations past is something that is connected to who we are today. And he talks about this idea that when we look at Teshuvah as a process that's something that we're engaged in, it's something that fixes not only what we have done, but also what had happened in previous generations. In other words, it's all one organic whole, and this idea that we can remember what went wrong, what caused, and this is for my colleagues' next class, what went wrong and caused the destruction, and we have to try to fix those things, because if not, then we're kind of like continuing the past. That's essentially what Harambam is saying. So seeing us all as part of this process and being responsible, so to speak, for what went on in the past, even in the present. So much so that in the next source in the Gemara in Yerushalmi, it says, Kol dor she'eino nivna b'yamav malin alav ki'ilu hechrivo. And this is a very shocking statement that I think is hard for us to hear sometimes, but the Gemara really says that any generation that doesn't see the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash in its time, it's as if they destroyed it. And that's a very shocking statement. That's a very hard statement to hear. But it speaks to our responsibility. It says to us what has changed between that generation and this generation. Are the causes of the destruction still present among us? Have we eradicated whatever it is that went wrong? Have we bettered ourselves? So if we haven't gotten to a point where we've put ourselves in a situation where now we could say, we're worthy of a situation where we have this amazing spiritual center, connection between heaven and earth. If we don't have it, or we don't have the ability to have it, that means something's wrong. It means there's more work to be done. That's essentially what the Gemara is saying. Yeah.
I like that reference to the Beit HaMikdash. Because people don't realize what it is. It's not just a building, it's a
100%.
Shechin.
100%.
How did you define it exactly?
Well, I see it as the meeting between heaven and earth. Chachamim call Jerusalem really the belly button of the world. Like it's just the.
So it's not a building. We should understand it's not a building. It's really about
100%.
bringing Hashem back into the world.
Yes.
That's the sad part, right?
Yes, and we'll talk about it later, hopefully if we have time, which we don't have a lot of, but the idea also that the Beit HaMikdash, we think of it as a Jewish institution, which it is, but if you go back to Melech Shlomo,
Really?
Non-Jews as well were able to pray at the Beit HaMikdash. It wasn't just in other words, we tend to think of the Beit HaMikdash as a specifically Jewish institution,
what
which
type
it is
of
in terms of the work,
What type
that
of
we do.
people?
If you go back to the Psukim, which I didn't bring in because I said we don't have time, but Shlomo, when he consecrates the Beit HaMikdash, he says anybody that comes by that would like to come in and to pray to God, it was not something that was. So I guess this is what prompted me to actually do this class this way, is that when we talk about the future, which hopefully we'll get to soon, it's not just about us building the most beautiful shul that we ever had, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for something much more, something much grander, that has to do with our national mission as a chosen nation and our impact on the world.
Give me chills, Miriam.
Say again?
You give me chills.
Yeah. And it's going to be based on this book I'll talk to you in a minute. I hope we'll have time. Rabbi Sachs on Future Tense. It's amazing what he says. This idea that Judaism has essentially turned inwards. This is a spoiler. I'll get to it in a minute. Judaism has turned inwards, and really we have to be turning outwards as well. So that's something we'll hopefully get to if we have time. Okay. So Kol HaMitzvah B'El Yerushalayim Zocheh. Oh, sorry. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Hold on one second. Right. Kol Dor She'eino Nivna B'Ema. Okay. So now I wanted to just skip to a very interesting Rashi that I only came across recently. Where do you have it on your sheet? My sheet's different. Rashi Al Shemot. Po. Does everybody see that? It's on the top of the page. Sorry, it's not. I don't think there's big numbers here. But okay. This Rashi is coming from a pasuk in Shemot. El Pekudei Mishkan, Mishkan HaHidud. Talking about the tabernacle that was in the midst of Bnei Israel when they were going through the Midbar. So Rashi has a very interesting comment about the term Mishkan. But before we get to it, I just want to ask the question, could any of us ever imagine the idea of the Beit HaMikdash being destroyed as actually a positive thing? This is what prompts me to look at this. Because we never ever think of the idea of the Beit HaMikdash being destroyed as being positive. So much death, so much destruction, so much uprooting. It's horrific. We can't imagine in any way that it would be positive. However, when we look at this Rashi, we see that he has an explanation of the term Mishkan as collateral, meaning that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed so that the relationship between God and the Jews could continue. We had gotten to such a low point, it seems, that we were so not worthy even of our existence at that point. And instead of the Jews being destroyed, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. So let's look at this. Next two sources here. המשכן, משכן שני פעמים רמז למקדש שנתמשכן בשני חורבנים על עוונותיהם של ישראל. So Rashi is quoting the Tanchuma on this, saying that why do we have this term Mishkan mentioned twice in this pasuk in Shemot? It's mentioned here twice, in allusion to both Batei HaMikdash, the first and the second, that were destroyed as he says here, as a security for Israel's repentance, meaning God, so to speak, he gave the Beit HaMikdash to us, but took it back. Took it back because we weren't doing what needed to be done. But at the same time that happened, the relationship between God and the Jews continued into exile. Let's look at the next source. So this will, I think, flesh it out a little bit easier. The Midrash in Zutah Shir Shirim, Mishkani acharecha narutza. So from this pasuk we learn mi shemeshachno latun biyad chavero huratz acharav shelo b'tovato kach nasu Yisrael mashkon lemi shebara ha'olam. So this idea that, let's say a person, I don't know, he's borrowing something from his friend, he gives him collateral, he gives him something to hold on to while he's borrowing. One whose collateral is given to a friend, he runs after it. In other words, I want to be paid back, right? In other words, the person who lends it wants to be paid back eventually. So the collateral is valuable. He runs after it. So too, Bnei Israel were considered the collateral in this midrash of Borei Olam. So the idea that like God took back the Beit HaMikdash as it were, but He wants something in return. He's seeking our relationship. We still have this relationship with God, which has to continue and miraculously continues. It's really amazing when you think about it. How did the Jews continue after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash? Like it doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever to not have any anything that we knew that was familiar, and we had to start all over again. When, like Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "Tenli yavne v'chachameh," the idea of starting anew, a whole different way. I just think about that and I say, wow, it's really, really something. Okay, so this idea that the Beit HaMikdash being destroyed, although it's not a positive thing, it does indicate that there's still an ongoing relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what is that relationship? That brings me to the part of the shiur that I wanted to really discuss our future. We've been looking back until now. We've looked back at the destruction, and we've looked back at what's been lost. Started to talk a little bit about what the purpose of the day is in terms of trying to change our ways and become better so that we can be worthy of the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, which is reminiscent of course, a bigger era, the Messianic era. And I want to talk now a little bit about what Rabbi Sachs describes. And Rabbi Sachs, for those of you who, I'm sure everybody knows him, but Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the most eloquent, amazing, erudite speaker, thinker in the last century, he really speaks a lot about the future of the Jewish people, meaning our status as a chosen people has to do with what we do in the future and how we impact the world. So I want to just run to that now. I don't think I gave you the source. Let me just see. No, I think I'm going to leave these sources now. Okay, I'll go to him. All right, so Rabbi Sachs, among other things that he does in this wonderful book, which I recommend to everybody, called Future Tense, he basically says that Judaism is not for Jews alone, which in and of itself is a pretty interesting statement, right? Another interesting statement I tell my students sometimes, and they look at me kind of funny, I say, God's not Jewish. But that's a separate story. Okay, so Judaism is not for Jews alone. He talks about the fact that we gave to the world the concept of a creator of the universe, and the fact that God created every single human being b'tselem Elokim, right? It doesn't say God created Jews in the image of God. God created everybody, every human being in His image. Very befitting, by the way. Again, reminiscent of my Rabbi Labaton. This is something he spoke a lot about. After the time of Noah, there was a covenant made with all of humanity. What was that covenant? Everybody needs to be moral. Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. But later on with Abraham, Rabbi Sachs describes how he was told, "V'nivrachu b'cha kol hagoyim." We forget that pasuk sometimes. But Abraham is told by God, through you, the rest of the world is going to be blessed. So Judaism, he says, is unique. And he offers 4 features of Judaism, 3 of which we'll try to briefly summarize here. And I think this will tie in to what the purpose of this day is. So, he talks about this idea of the birth of history. If we look back, in the time of ancient peoples, the belief was that time was cyclical. Just like nature, there's birth, and then something deteriorates and eventually dies. The ancients saw the time as cyclical. What happened before will happen again. Change was seen as some sort of an illusion. No such thing as change. Everything is just going to repeat itself over and over again. And natural life was seen as the struggle between chaos and order. And what he says, Rabbi Sachs, which Rabbi Sachs I think is amazing, is that the Torah is a radical break with this way of seeing life. The idea that we can't only say that what was will be, but we can actually find God in history. That's what he says, and not just in nature. God is found in history, and things can change. This is a radical idea. We take it for granted. It's like we breathe. But we have to understand that this is a revolutionary, radical notion. And what he says is that human life is actually an arena for transformation. So this is what Rabbi Sachs is describing, and he says how Abraham and Moshe introduced this radical idea that what was in the past does not predict what's going to be in the future. By the way, there's still some cultures today that we know still believe in this way. Whereas the Greeks wrote about the past, according to Rabbi Sachs, the Nevi'im, our Nevi'im, looked at history as having meaning. These aren't just events. We're minimizing it if we say today on Tish'a B'Av, we're just looking at the past and that's it. We have to see everything as an evolutionary process that we take part in. So this idea that the future can be different from the past is one of Rabbi Sachs' first descriptions of what makes Judaism unique. And he took, can I read this to you? Hold on 1 second. I feel like I want to give you like the whole book in 2 seconds. Hold on 1 second. 234. If I'm going to find it. Yeah, the concept that within the history of mankind itself, a process was at work which would mold the future, lead man to situations totally different from the past, seems to have found its first expression among the Jews. The uniqueness of this concept is the basic idea of development. The past was no longer static, but now a mere example event, but now a dynamic unfolding story. So this is something that Rabbi Sachs brings up as like an amazing contribution of the Jews to the world. Then he goes to another idea, which is a story without an ending. He says something very interesting, that the nature of Tanakh is actually, it's a book of stories, right? We read all the books of Tanakh, and it's a book of stories. But he sees Judaism as a sequence of events that have to play itself out over time. Meaning it's not a book I read, I put it down, and then I'm done. It's a constantly evolving process. So he sees Tanakh as a unique story that actually breaks the rules of all narrative form. So it's actually a story without an ending, when you think about it. We're told different themes in the Torah about the Jewish people, and they have a land of Israel. Abraham will have many, many children, and the other nations will be blessed by Abraham. But we're always in the middle of the story, according to Rabbi Sachs. We're not finished yet. The ending, he says, lies in the future. So I think that's also a fascinating idea. The unsurpassed memory of a future yet to be fulfilled. Okay, so that's his second idea. So just to review, again, the first idea that we mentioned was this idea of the birth of history, seeing God in history, that the idea that the future could be different from the past is a Jewish concept. And then Rabbi Sachs talks about this idea of the Jewish people's story being a story that's ongoing, that hasn't yet ended. We're making our story. That's, I guess, essentially what I was get out of that point. And then the last point here that he makes is that Judaism, he says, is the only civilization whose golden age is in the future. We invented this concept of the messianic idea. Messianic idea, the messianic era, is something that other religions have borrowed from us, but it's something that all the Nevi'im spoke about. And if you look at it, it's a very universal concept.
Quick question.
Sure.
Mashiach. My son asked me yesterday, and why don't we build it? Is there a train of thought? I know some people want to build it, but is there a train of thought?
Build a Beit HaMikdash.
Yeah, that we have to wait for Mashiach. The Mashiach in the building of is right. That's the.
Well, it depends on who you ask, I guess. I mean, there's a place in Jerusalem where they're actually creating the vessels as we speak for the Beit HaMikdash to be rebuilt. But there are others who will say
no, but that's a. What does our rabbi say?
What does
Rabbi Labaton say? Oh, do you know or you don't know?
I mean, I can't speak for him, but I would imagine that we're not there fully yet. Like we're
but
waiting.
I mean, is that a concept that we have to Mashiach, and a lot of people believe we have to wait for Mashiach to build the temple?
Well, that's actually a sign, according to Rambam, of Mashiach being who he is that he does rebuild the Beit HaMikdash.
Okay.
But the question is, do we help in that process beforehand? What do you say, Esther?
Oh, you can help, but actually building it is.
Right. This is also reminiscent of a much bigger topic of discussion, like just Israel in general. There are those who believe that we had to, fight our wars and build the country and make it what it is. And there's a whole school of thought in Judaism, lots of people who believe, no, we should be waiting, we shouldn't be doing anything, we should be waiting for the miraculous time when Israel will be rebuilt. Right. So you have these streams in Judaism. We always have, what is it, 2 Jews and 3 opinions?
That's a big that's a minority.
Not in Israel, maybe, I don't know.
No, I'm talking about not living in it, not.
There are Jews currently living in Israel who live in Israel, but say that it shouldn't be built as a Jewish state. Right. Well, and they won't send their kids to the army, things like that.
Secular Jews. No, you're talking religious Jews.
Religious Jews. Religious Jews. It's both. All right, so just to summarize, because I see we're running out of time. to get to the punchline here, he says, Rabbi Sack, that Judaism is the voice of hope in the conversation of humankind. It's one of his most eloquent statements. And we choose hope and try to defeat tragedy wherever possible. In other words, we, the Jews, and our story is something so unique that has inspired so many other minorities and other peoples in the world. We don't believe in things like genetic determinism, blind fate, or that God is indifferent. The exact opposite. We believe that God is there to respond to us, to be a force in our lives. To be Jews means, he says, to be agents of hope. Just like God is free, so are we free to create and to build. And every mitzvah, he says, is about what it means to be a free human being and a free people. And the belief in the future is that we act together as this covenantal community, and this Jewish story, he says, is not just ours. It's basically all of humanity's story. So again, going back to this idea that Abraham was told, "V'nivruchu b'cha kol hagoyim," all the nations of the world will be blessed by you. And Moshe also said, "Ki hi chochmatchem u'binatchem le'nei ha'amim." Moshe also told the Jewish people, this Torah, this way of living is your sign of wisdom that all the other nations are going to see and learn from. And we know that our role as the chosen people is to teach morality to the world. That is the definition of what it means to be the chosen people. You notice how Judaism is the only religion that doesn't go around proselytizing? We're not looking to convert anybody. The Muslims believe the rest of the world should be Muslim. Christians believe the rest of the world should be Christian. We, as Jews, do not go around proselytizing. Chabad is an exception, trying to bring Jews back to Judaism. But that's essentially what our belief is, that we all are created b'tzelem Elokim. We all have a moral life to live. And, it's funny, there's 8 billion people in the world. Do we think that God only looks at the 14 million Jews? Like, what about the rest of the world? So this is where we come back to our point that Rabbi Sachs had made, that he sees at least the fact that the Jews have essentially turned inward. Meaning, it's wonderful that we have religious communities. And it's wonderful that we're trying to build all our institutions and even the Beit HaMikdash, God willing, one day. But if we look at it, as we said before, as only a Jewish enterprise, we've missed the boat. We have to remember that we have a mission in life. Our mission, the Jews were chosen to be God's representative in the world. Israel, spoiler for later if anybody wants to join the Aliyah discussion, Israel is the platform where that takes place. But the idea that the Jews have a mission, and we have ideals such as freedom, human dignity, world responsibility, these are Jewish concepts, and this is what we can teach the world. So he sees Judaism as a faith that is in actually the future tense, as he said, with the voice of hope in the conversation of mankind. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Tish'a BeAb? If we look back and we say again that the destruction happened because we weren't being enough of a moral people, we weren't doing what we needed to be doing, we weren't fulfilling our mission as the chosen people. So we look back and we say, okay, that's the past, but we now know that we have the ability in this generation and in every generation to change and to make things better. And if we're not, that's what we have to be working on today. What is it we have to identify, what we have to be doing on an individual level and also on a collective level in order to hasten the coming of redemption, which again, we don't have time for it today, but when you look at the Nevi'im, it doesn't talk about only the Jewish people are being redeemed. It talks about the entire world coming to an era. Anybody ever see in the UN, I'm sure you've seen, the pasuk from Yeshaya on the UN building, the idea that they're going to turn their swords into plowshares, taken straight from Yeshaya. This idea of universal peace, eradicating poverty, famine, making things good for all human beings because they're all created in Elohim. That's our job. And on Tish'a BeAb, we have to remember that. We have to recommit, I think, to our national mission. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we can help bring this concept of universal peace to the world. So thank you all very much. And Tisku b'nechamat Zion.
Amen.